slowly coming in. Today we are meeting for the third time, so it's our last workshop. And so we have a special treat for you because, as you know, we have two amazing guests today, Dick Schwartz, the creator of IFS, and Michael Mithofer. So this will be a very interesting workshop. First, Richard will have his 1 hour presentation, then Michael will have his 1 hour presentation, and then we will do nearly 2 hours of Q&A with both Dick and Michael. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Have an amazing experience. And I give the floor to Bob.
I am very happy today because I'm grateful that we have two of the world's greatest experts in their fields here with us today. And they don't really need any introduction, so I'm not going to give them much. Dick Schwartz is the founder of IFS. What else can I say? Probably the fastest growing kind of psychotherapy in the world today. So, Dick, take it away.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Bob and Michael. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you. I kind of wish I'd taken this course because, you know, I'm still learning like you are, and it sounds like it's been really great. And I, you know, worry that I don't have an hour's worth of material to talk about, but we'll see how that goes. So my understanding is that everybody knows at least something about IFS. Is that right? Yeah? Okay. So I don't have to give an intro to the model, so I won't. So you do know that there are these parts, there's the natural state of the mind to have parts, and that they're forced out of their naturally valuable states by trauma and attachment injuries into extreme roles, and some of them become exiled and because they get hurt, and some of them then are forced to be protectors to try and contain the exiles and also protect them from being triggered. And so, and then also there is the self, which is really the big deal about IFS, that's in everybody and can't be damaged and is just beneath the surface of these parts, such that when they open space, it emerges spontaneously with those 8C word qualities and knows how to heal. There's a kind of natural knowledge about how to relate in a healing way, both in the internal world and in the external world. And so how does all that apply to the psychedelic renaissance, which I am very excited about, and I have some concerns about as well, and I'll try to talk about both of those as we go. So my excitement is that my personal experience, and I have experience with ketamine several times, actually with Bob Grant as my facilitator, who spoke to you already, and very profound experiences with the ketamine stuff. And then I have some experience with psilocybin also, and then just really one experience with MDMA. But some of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm drawing on those experiences as well as you know, I've sat with people who've been doing these things as well. So why am I excited about it? You know, we do pretty well without the medicines. We can heal a lot of stuff. And actually, our outcome, we did an outcome study with PTSD and had comparable results to the results that Michael's had with all the phases of the trials. And I have clients where I get stuck and don't know how to get past certain protectors or get to certain exiles. And my experience has been that having them have some kind of a psychedelic experience can really get us unstuck and in a powerful way, in a quick way. So that's one reason why I am excited about it. I also think, and I'm in the middle of reading a book that I'd recommend called The Immortality Key. Has anybody read that? A few of you? It's quite eye-opening. And the basic premise is that most all of the world's spiritual traditions were based on psychedelic experiences of the ancients. And there's this new technology that allows you to better analyze the residue in chalices and goblets and things like that. And they're finding that there's all this ergot there. There's all this, the psychedelic stuff. And so why do I mention that? Well, it's my belief that psychedelics can open a door to this very spiritual world that ordinarily we don't have any access to. And the wisdom from that world is very needed right now. We need more access to that. And so that's another reason I'm excited about it. So I'll riff a little bit on the spiritual side of self, which I don't know that we talk that much about in the level ones, if you've done the level ones or anything else. But for that to make sense, I need to expand the thinking about what I'm calling self. So, and some of my thinking does come from those psychedelic experiences that I had personally. So what we're calling self that is in your clients that you can access when they're doing the IFS work, for me is just a drop of a bigger ocean. And that bigger ocean is really the self, all caps. And that the more you unburden, the more access, the more of that oceanic self can enter your body, and you can lead more with it and get more guidance that way. And that at least some psychedelics take you there in a big way. And you have that non-dual, boundaryless sense of connectedness, this pure connectedness, and that can be very blissful, actually, was for me. And coming back then, and actually Bob was there for at least one of those experiences, and can tell you the kind of things I was saying as I came back. Coming back, you have a whole new realization about several things. One is that this is a pretty hard place we're in compared to that. And that these bodies that we have really limit how much of that seaward connectedness we can feel. And that there's much, much more out there, such that when you die, it's just a transition and you go to this bigger self. All of that's a very powerful healing realization. It really helps, that's partly why psilocybin is so effective with end-of-life people, because they're getting a hit of that when they die, it's not the end. So, so that's one aspect of psychedelics I'm excited about, because not all of them, I think particularly ketamine and psilocybin give you access to that non-dual place. MDMA, you kind of stay here. You stay in your body, but you access an enormous amount of self in your body. So you feel calm, you feel very, very open-hearted, so you feel a huge amount of connectedness to the people around you and compassion. And that is a very powerful experience also. So my take is that each of these medicines access different of those C words. There's something about them that put the person's protectors to sleep very quickly. And so they have an enormous amount of self that comes in. And that access to that level of self, either in the MDMA session where you do stay in your body, or as you're coming back from the ketamine session or the psilocybin session, and you have a lot of self in your body. That is a big invitation to parts that ordinarily you don't have access to. They feel now is a safe time to come out. And so I'm really glad that Michael's here today, because he's told me several times that, at least in the early phase of MDMA research, and I'll let him tell you more about it, he kept track of how often people spontaneously started doing IFS without any cueing from him, or at least spontaneously started seeing parts and getting to know their parts. And that actually, him telling me that, and as I recall, Michael, it's over 70%. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, getting high 70%. Yeah, with the active
High
dose.
70%.
I've got a little graph of that I'll talk about. But yeah, it's quite remarkable how often it comes up.
Fantastic. So that's what I mean. When you access that kind of level of self, parts just kind of go for it. They just come out spontaneously. And then you, because you're in self, you know how to relate to them in a healing way. And Michael will show a video when it's his turn that illustrates just what I'm talking about. And so, so that was very validating for me, because it sort of confirmed that I had stumbled on a way that people already know how to heal. If all the protectors get out of the way and you have enough self, you just start to do it. You just start to heal yourself. And I just stumbled into that. So it was validating at that level. It's also been validating because this crusade I've had to help people know that self is in there and it can't be damaged, and it just is. It has these 8 C's, and I've had a lot of skepticism as I've tried to bring that to the psychotherapy world, because attachment theory is so prevalent as a basis for understanding people and for treating them, psychotherapy. And before anybody gets reactive and defensive, I love attachment theory. There are many aspects of it that are really important regarding IFS, except for one, which is the proposition that in order to have anything like those 8 C's, you had to have had a certain kind of parenting during a critical period in your childhood. And if you didn't get that, you're out of luck until you get it from some external person, from a therapist or from an intimate partner, but it's not inherent in you. And that's what I believed when I started doing this work. But as I did it and got parts to separate and self just showed up, even in people who had horrific backgrounds, who had been abused on a daily basis through their childhood. And so I would search their histories to see who was the person that they got it from. Unsuccessfully, there was nobody. And yet there it was. So that flew in the face of basic attachment theory. And so I struggled for a long time to try and make sense of it. And it really wasn't until some students and colleagues started to say, well, maybe what we're talking about is what Buddhists call Buddha nature, or Hindus call Atman, or Christians call Christ consciousness, or so on and so on. And Bob and I wrote a book that I really, really like called Many Minds, One Self, where we went through all the different spiritual traditions and how they describe what we're calling self. And you just see how it's really the same thing everybody's talking about. And it's so ironic that virtually every spiritual tradition knows about this, and almost no other psychotherapies know about this. So I became a much more spiritual person, much more spiritual in my own thinking, and trying to meditate more to get more access to that wisdom, and also in my teaching. And this latest book that just came out this year, No Bad Parts, I kind of come out of the closet about a lot of the spirituality of IFS. Not totally, as Bob and I have had our debates about, but so where was I with that? There was some kind of point I was going to make about all this, I think. Anybody remember my last couple of sentences? Or where I might have been headed?
I think you were heading toward the more spiritual nature of IFS. And
yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And so that is an attraction to psychedelics because, again, they can give you very quick access to that realm. And it's very real. And yeah. So for all those reasons, I'm really thrilled with this Renaissance. I'm really grateful to Michael for spearheading it. Basically, I mean, it's he and Rick Doblin, who I've gotten to know much better recently, because he lives in the Boston area too, and he and I have gone out several times. Are my heroes. They really this wouldn't be happening without them. So huge amounts of gratitude. And as I'm sure you guys have talked about, and Bob's probably talked about in this course so far, I have a lot of concerns about this too. I see what could be called the medicalization of it happening, where increasingly people are seeing the salubrious, which is a word I used way too often in high school. So I had anyway, but I love the word. So the positive effects are being attributed, the healing effects are too often being attributed to the medicine itself and not the process. And as a result, you have these ketamine clinics where people walk in, somebody gives them the ketamine, they leave them alone. And then they walk out. I mean, I'm appalled that this is allowed to happen. So that's just one symptom of this medicalization of the whole process. And again, I'm very grateful to Michael and others who have emphasized set and setting, the importance of the presence of the facilitator, how dangerous it can be at times. Why can it be dangerous? So, just as I said that the accessing of a lot of self is an invitation to lots of parts, it also can be an invitation to scary parts, to parts that had been locked away, sometimes for pretty good reasons. And when they come in, they can look very scary to the facilitator also. And it can look like your subject is having a panic attack or a rage attack or things like that. And if you as the facilitator start to pathologize the client and think, oh shit, this person's a lot sicker than I thought, and you get a protective part that takes over you, then it's a shitstorm. Then it's a parts party where your protector will trigger your subject's protector, get more extreme, and they'll have what we think of as a bad trip. But if instead, and those can be very damaging, those kinds of experiences. If instead you can stay in self even when your subject is in an extreme place, and in your mind you're thinking, oh, okay, here comes a protector that needs some attention. Not, oh my God, he's having a panic attack. Then you can help your client stay in self and start to get to know that whatever part it was that came in that way. And it becomes a healing experience, ultimately. So, and I'm sure you guys have covered this, but the state of the facilitator is crucial in the success and the healing doing this work. And it's again something that Michael and Rick have emphasized, and to their, to the credit of our field, that they've been very careful about set and setting, and I think to some degree screening of people, and because these are very potent interventions into delicate systems, and it's like any delicate ecology, the potential both for the kind of experiences I described, where you're inviting all kinds of scary formerly exiled parts, but also for what we call backlash after the dosing session. So let me talk a little about that. So, and actually, when I heard about the project, the MDMA project and other projects, I had a concern that there would be a lot more backlash than, as far as I have heard, than there has been. And I'm kind of puzzled by that. And I'll tell you why, because, and I think it has to do with the population that I was working with when I developed IFS, which was a very volatile group of horrific abuse survivors, what would be called complex trauma, complex PTSD, and had very extreme parts, and had been tortured on a daily basis often in their childhoods. And as a result, and a lot of perpetrators know that that their safety depends on their ability to get rid of their victim self. Not get rid of it, just not have their victim have any access to self. And so whenever they would see self in their victims, they would torture more. And so those survivors came to associate the presence of self in their body with more torture. And so there are, in those people, there are protectors whose job it is to keep self out of their body. And so my fear was that as they quickly access self this way, that there would be a huge backlash to that. And I'm curious when Michael and I talk if you ever experience any of that kind of thing. And that's partly why IFS, as you know, is what I call a constraint releasing model, where instead of trying to help people resource themselves, and people do that not just with psychedelics, but through all kinds of breathing techniques and other ways to try and access more self. We don't do that because of this fear that that's going to scare protectors. So instead, we have the client focus on a protector, and negotiate with it about separating. And we don't have them access self until these protectors, basically by separating, are giving implicit permission for it to come. And if there's a lot of fear of letting the client, and it isn't just the survivors that I described that have fear, they're often people who didn't have as severe kinds of perpetrators, but they have parts that are really, really afraid of them taking risks in life. And self will do that. Self has that C word, courage. So if you access a lot of self, the parts that are terrified, now you're going to get it, will come in and backlash. So IFS, I'm really hoping that IFS can become at least one of the primary maps to this territory. And I'm also grateful to Michael for, I know in the MAPS training, there's at least some IFS being taught, and I'd like to talk to you actually about maybe increasing that somehow. We are working with Phil Wolfson now, and he's going to incorporate a lot of IFS into his training program. So my hope, and I know that Michael already does some of this, is that in, for example, the preparatory sessions, that the protectors who might have a lot of fear about the journey are solicited and asked about their fear, and that the facilitator addresses their fear. Because I've known, what's it called? Word of mouth. What's the other word for that? Of people where, because that didn't happen, they're anecdotal. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Laura. I've known anecdotally that because that didn't happen, even people who had high dosage, they just didn't have an experience. Their protector didn't leave, and they had no experience whatsoever. I've also noted people where the protector didn't leave and they had a terrifying experience because it felt like their ego was dissolving and there was, they were going to die. And I'm convinced that if those parts can be addressed in advance of the dosing session, a lot of that can be prevented. And even when it can't be prevented, that in the integration sessions, it can be addressed as a part who, felt like it wasn't listened to and had to sabotage the whole experience. And it can be apologized to. So some of the integration session can be devoted to any level of backlash that might have occurred. But also in the integration sessions, going and finding the parts that came in during the dosing sessions and begin to allow the client to form relationships with those parts that aren't based just on the medicine being available, and become part of the daily practice of the client and facilitating all of that, and sort of sending them on the daily practice route with IFS. So so those are some of my concerns. I think also, and maybe you've talked about this already, and I see a question, is self-analogous to dissolved ego? It is actually, yeah, in a sense, because I'm just reading some of the others. It's if by separating the ego gets a horrible name in spiritual circles. It's like the enemy, the ego, or the ego is at best a big pest, and at worst a kind of enemy. And the goal becomes to dissolve the ego. So you enter that big self state I was talking about earlier. But the ego is just a collection of little manager parts, and they're just trying to keep you safe. And then you get furious with them, or you disparage them as keeping you attached to this world, and all the negative things that a lot of traditions use. And there's way too much of that in the psychedelic world also. There's way too much of disparaging of protective parts. So yes, when the ego, quote unquote, dissolves, which simply means these protectors go to sleep, or they take a break, and then you do act spontaneously and automatically, you access all of this self. That's all it means. And the self is what people are shooting for in these spiritual traditions. And the goal for me isn't to be in self all the time, actually. Certainly not to be in that non-dual unity state all the time, not to spend all your time in the ocean. The goal is to bring a lot of the wisdom and energy from those trips you took back to these parts and use it to heal them and love them and help them out of their nasty roles so they can be who they're designed to be, which again is always valuable. So these are some of my concerns. I do know that particularly MDMA, and Michael can speak to this, can create this intense bonding between the facilitator and the subject, and that can lead to various forms of abuse, and there's lots of documentation of that. And I think that's partly, again, Michael can speak to this, but I think that's partly why the MAPS protocol always has 2 people in the room. So those are some of the concerns I have.
Dick?
Yeah.
there's something I think really important. Your laws of inner physics that you developed in working in the inner world with IFS seem to apply so well to the medicine world, especially that idea that if you're not afraid of it, nothing in the inner world can hurt you. So could you go over your laws of inner physics, please?
Well, I can't remember all of them, but that's certainly an important one. They're listed in that second edition we did, I think. That's where they are. But yeah, the one you're mentioning, Bob, is crucial. It really is key in navigating these inner worlds. And just to repeat, and I found this, I just stumbled onto this discovery many, many years ago, that there's nothing in your inner system that has any power whatsoever when you're in self. And I've been operating that way now for, well, since I discovered it, which was probably at least 30 years ago. And I've had people encounter terrifying things initially in their inner world. And once we got the scared parts into a safe place and they were fully in self and they weren't afraid, they were able to just send it out of their system. Never failed. So the moral of that story is, if you can hold self-energy as a facilitator and help your subject stay in self-energy, anything that comes in, you don't have to worry about, basically, because it has no power. And that's a big deal too. And it echoes the importance of you as a facilitator holding self-energy, because self-energy is contagious. So if I'm in self and I'm with somebody that's doing the medicine, it's gonna pull for their self. It's like a tuning fork. My tuning fork is vibrating and it starts to vibrate theirs. And they're gonna be much more likely to be in self-leadership as they go through the experience, even when scary things come. Is there another of those laws that you want me to riff on, Bob?
I'm not. I have a perhaps embarrassing question, Dick. Would it be okay if I described one of our sessions when we both did ketamine together?
Yeah, although are you going to describe what happened to you or to me?
Oh, the interaction.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Dick was yelling, bup, 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 oh boy, bup, 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 oh boy, in a very loud voice. And I was growling like a dog. And there was somebody else in the room. Dr. Grant was supervising this with Dr. Morgan. So, you know, this was like an official supervised legal session. Somebody else in the room turned into a Buddha, absolutely quiet and still. And he and I are thrashing around like this. And he's going, then he does this. Bup, 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 oh boy, shut up, Bob. Bup, 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 oh boy. Shut up, Bob. And I yelled back, let's give him a lecture, Dr. Schwartz.
Yeah, I do remember that well, because you were a maniac. So, yeah. There was another time, because my wife was there too. And when I go to these places, I start to interact with what we call guides. I don't know if you've gotten into that at all in this course.
Not much. That'd be good
Not
to talk.
much, yeah. But so I'm coming back and I'm saying, okay, and I'm saying, I'll remember, but don't leave me. Please don't leave me. Please don't leave me. And my wife says, I won't. I say, I'm not talking to you. Which she took very personally. Yeah, so you have very wild experiences sometimes. Let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to say. Um, what I can say also is, I know, Bob, you were talking about trainings for IFS and psychedelics, and we are talking about offering a level 2 training for specializing in this. And excuse me, and we have a couple projects ongoing or just kind of starting. Excuse me again. One is with psilocybin and end of life in IFS. There's a woman named Lou Lucas who's at the University of Nebraska and is connected to Johns Hopkins. And so we've done a round of training with the facilitators there, and I'm not sure if they're waiting for COVID to die down before they're starting, but I'm excited about that project. And there's a group called Nova Mind who do a lot of research around psychedelics. And so we're going to do a project with eating disorders and psilocybin and IFS, an outcome study. And just trying to think if there's anything that I didn't talk about that I think is important.
I'll just put in a few words while you're checking out on that. Lou Lucas in Omaha, Nebraska, doing this psilocybin study is amazing because Omaha is the center of the country, maybe the most conservative, straight-laced Protestant part of America, and psilocybin is there. To me, that is like, oh, everything's changed now. I have another question for you, Dick.
Go ahead.
I think the 8 C's, they're a great description of self as it comes in our body. But have you added qualities to describe the bigger self where it's all capitals? Or do you have any other words or invitations to that kind of big self?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Bob. So, the connectedness C word is certainly what people experience there. Often also experience calm, but not always. There's a kind of euphoria that comes with finally getting out of these bodies and getting into that place. At least that was my experience. And I have to say, in one of those trips with Bob Grant, part of it was I visited a not so great place, and my parts were a bit disturbed by what I saw there, and I could stay in self and just kind of observe it, but it left me with this knowledge that there are sort of dark pockets up there as well, which only makes sense that there would be burdens at that level too. So I think what's really stuck with me since those experiences is this sense of a lack of fear of death and a kind of knowledge. I mean, I used to sort of believe that something happened when you died that was probably good. And from a lot of the work I've done with clients' parts and with their guides, that's what they say, the guides. But now I know it. It's not like even a question. So there is that kind of security almost that comes with that kind of experience. What else can I say about it? Other words, bliss, joy, of course. Perspective is a big one. We have in addition to the 8 C's, we have the 5 P's, because I like alliteration. And one of those is perspective. That it really gives you a different perspective on this place. On this is a very difficult school that we are in. And our lesson plans are in the set of burdens that we get, both from direct experience in life, but also the legacy burdens that we inherit. And as you unburden, or as your clients unburden, you're doing what you're here to do. You're both learning things from the unburdening process and the witnessing of what happened, and also you are you're bringing into your body more self, because the burdens are pretty dense energy. They don't allow full embodiment of self. And some of the sort of vision that keeps me going, despite how bad things seem in the world, is having worked with clients where things seem very, very hopeless and powerless, and there was no self around to be seen, and like nothing could be done. But as I got some protectors to separate and more self came in, things started to change very quickly. And I believe that's true also of this larger system that we're all a part of. That if we can just bring in some kind of critical mass of self, things can change for the better very quickly. And so every time you unburden in your system, or you unburden a client, whether it's through a psychedelic experience or not, that's bringing more self to this plane. And one of my new ambitions is to do much more collective unburdening. And I've done a few experiences where we have a lot of people do this at once, and it's very, very powerful. So anyway, I forget how I got onto that, but that's partly why I'm excited about ketamine, because psychedelics, because they do open the door for more self to come into this planet, into this realm. And again, even if things look really dire, when you get that critical mass of self, everything starts to change and heal. So perspective. So the 5 P's are perspective, patience, playfulness, oddly enough.
Persistence.
Persistence, thank you, Bob. And what's the 5th? Presence. So your presence in self, your ability to be present in self. And you can only be present in self, in the present, if you don't have a lot of parts frozen in time in the past. Because not all of you is going to be present, which is another reason to do a lot of work. And earlier, Bob, you asked about a curriculum, I think, for IFS and psychedelics. And, there are a lot of things that I can't teach, which Bob Grant, I know you had on, and Michael's here today, and their expertise is much more in those areas. But for me, the facilitator's ability to stay in self and to know when they're not, to know when parts have come in, which should be a big part of the curriculum. And practice with that, and practice role play triggering situations. So, uh, yeah.
Dick, if you could, in your last few minutes, would you talk more about meeting guides and how to develop that contact and turn it into an ongoing part of your life?
Yeah, I will with some reluctance because I still want IFS to get into the bastions of Harvard Medical School and other, you know, hardcore psychology departments. So I really don't want it to be written off as woo-woo, even though it kind of is.
Sure.
So be discreet who you tell about this. But yeah, I learned about guides long before I had tried psychedelics or had clients that had. And often when you open up in this inner world, clients would spontaneously say, and there's somebody here to help me, and that presence would say the right words, or might even actually uh, help facilitate a piece of work, or bring in energy, bring in light. Different guides have different roles in that healing process. And at first I freaked out because I was in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Illinois in Chicago trying to get tenure. And so I was telling clients, just ignore that. Don't even go there. Then I got curious and I began asking if they're parts or what are they. And they'd say, no, we're not parts. Okay, and what are you? They would hedge a bit on that question. But now, many years later, I totally believe in that phenomena, that we all have these guides that are here to help us and can be accessed when you access enough self. And they won't come unless you invite them, though sometimes they will. And that myself and many of my clients have ongoing relationships with the guides. And it's very healing. And they want to help change things in this world as well. That's why they're there. And psychedelics can access that. So it's good to be aware of that and know it for what it is when guides start to show up, and how to best avail of their resources. Does that take care of it, Bob?
Yep. Yep.
So I think I pretty much blew my whatever here.
Well, you're down to the last mistake.
What?
You're down to your last 4 minutes, so you just about.
Okay.
One. You've talked about in the overall flow of the IFS model, there are three basic things, and the last of the three is reharmonizing the system.
Now there are four.
Now there are four. Oh yeah, being a self-led activist. But that reharmonizing the system seems to be a key to the integration process. In your last couple of minutes, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the four goals of IFS. The first is the liberation of these parts from the roles they've been forced into so they can be who they're designed to be. The second is to help restore the trust they lost in self-leadership when you were young and self didn't protect the system. So that they start to trust self as a leader again. And psychedelics can be very useful that way. And then the third is what Bob's alluding to. Not only liberate them, but bring them together and have them get to know each other differently and start to see how they want to work together and reharmonize this internal system that got blown apart by the traumas you suffered. And that can be a very moving and powerful thing, because when you have a lot of exiles or a lot of polarizations, you don't have access to all these wonderful qualities that these parts have, and especially when they're burdened, because they're consumed by the burdens. But once they're unburdened and you start bringing them together, people start crying because now they have things that they thought they'd lost forever back in their lives. And like the hard-ass strong part gets to know the scared, formerly scared little girl. And the little girl's talking about how they can work together because she can give the hard-ass part more heart, so it can be protective, but not so mean all the time, and so on and so on. So that's also a big, I think, a big opportunity for these integration sessions, for the parts that came forward to start to get to know each other differently and also start to trust self as a leader. Is that where you were headed, Bob?
Yep, exactly. Because that's one of the structures, I think, that from IFS that I think just goes right over to medicine work perfectly and really helps the medicine provider work in the integration sessions. That whole, all your work around reharmonizing the system.
Okay.
Thank you, Dick.
Thank you. I actually, a lot of stuff came out of me that I was surprised at. So I'm glad for the opportunity. I'm glad it's being videotaped.
Good. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And Michael.
Hi, Bob.
You're on. Oh, let me introduce you. Michael, the world's foremost expert on the therapeutic use of MDMA. Been doing this 23 years, 24 years, something like that. I don't know how many thousands of people he's worked with, but he knows this subject like nobody else on the planet.
Well, thanks, Bob. Maybe at least like nobody else that's above ground on the planet. There are a lot of, I want to, mention that there are cultures that go back thousands of years that have deep knowledge about working with these kinds of medicines. And there are a lot of other people that have been doing this in many ways for a long time. So I appreciate what you say. And, we're bringing it up into the scientific and medical community. And so it's really fun to be here. Thanks a lot for doing this and getting me and Dick together. It's always really fun to do something with you, Dick. We started working on this research, developing the first protocol in 2000. So it's been going on 22 years. And when we started, I didn't know anything about IFS. And I'm very grateful that I had stumbled into it. And so, obviously none of us would be talking about this at all if it hadn't been for Dick's amazing journey and bringing this to the world. But so we were, my wife Annie and I were co-therapists in most of the studies we did. We had started our first study with MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. It was mostly people with childhood sexual abuse or rape or assault, a lot of complex PTSD. Anyway, so we were getting that underway, and meanwhile, Annie, who's a nurse, started the Hakomi training, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And so one of the books she was assigned was the Mosaic Mind. Is that the right name, Dick?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, and she said, there's a conference. We were living in Charleston, South Carolina then. There was a conference in Hilton Head, not too far away. It was a pretty interesting conference. And she was reading about it. She said, there's this 4-day workshop with this guy named Richard Schwartz about this thing called IFS. Would you like to go? And, you know, normally my whole career I've been a junkie for learning anything new that might inform, you know, teaching me to work with people in a more effective way. But at that point I said, you know, my plate is completely full right now. You know, this was the first time we'd ever done a clinical trial. But, you know, it's close by. It'd be fun to go together. I'll come along and I'll sign up for this workshop. Well, I spent 4 days in the room with Dick and heard what he had to say and saw some examples of it. And I went up at the end. I said, Dick, could you please recommend an IFS therapist and tell me how to get in the training program? So it was like within less than 6 months, I was in the training, went on to do all 3 levels of the IFS training. It just added an incredible amount to what we've been doing, really. So tremendous gratitude for that, and I'll talk more about the specifics and how that kind of unfolded for us, because what we found was IFS was such a useful way to understand what was going on, and to also, you know, as you say, Dick, the ability to be present for the therapist to be present with enough self is crucial. It's part of the setting that holds the container for this work. So, and a couple of people, you know, it's already been mentioned a couple of times, some misgivings about bringing these medicines into the medical arena. And I share some of those misgivings too. And it's actually getting pretty strange lately, all these for-profit companies coming in, some of which I think are ethical and some may not be. So it's getting a little crazy. And I just want to acknowledge that the reason we felt compelled to do this and to bring it to try to get medical approval, you know, we're not there yet, but it's looking promising, was because we were seeing all these people who were suffering who needed something more. So we decided, you know, sure, people of privilege who have the you know, resources and the willingness to break the law, or to go get expensive ketamine treatments, although that I certainly agree with you, Dick, about how I feel about giving infusion without therapy. But anyway, you know, we know plenty of people that can access underground therapy and do their own self-exploration and healing, but the people we were seeing from day to day never would have had a chance to access, and some of the people that need help the most. So with some, you know, hopefully a sharp eye for the downsides of bringing it into the medical community, we decided it was necessary to do. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about the research and the medical part. At first, I'm going to go pretty fast through that, but I just want to put that in that perspective. So I think I'll share some PowerPoint. So, you know, I want to, before I talk about the research itself, I want to say a little bit about the way we're doing the research and the sponsor, because I think that's a very exciting thing too, is that, you know, our research has been all sponsored by MAPS, which is a 501c3, a nonprofit. The studies are actually run through the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, but there's only one shareholder, and that's the nonprofit. So if we get this drug approved, nobody's going to make money on it except for the nonprofit, which will take any profits and put it back into research and public benefit. So it's been exciting to be able to work with that kind of model. And this has taken a lot of people. I just want to express gratitude to all the people at MAPS and MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. They're more than you see here already, because it's growing fast as we approach applying for FDA approval. But and it's been made possible without any government or industry funding, all donations. So, what we're doing is not just a drug trial. The reason we think, even the VA has recognized that it's therapy, not pharmacology, that is really the treatment for PTSD. And of course, sometimes we can help people and sometimes we can't. So the idea of this is, let's see if we can have a way to catalyze psychotherapy. So it's not like the typical pharmacology. The drug is only taken a few times, and we think of it as a catalyst. So it's stimulating the person's own inner healing ability, is the way we see it. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but MDMA has been off patent since for a long time. It was patented in 1914, and it's a lot like, it's often called a psychedelic, but it's different from classic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. There's a lot of overlap, but MDMA, another word that's been suggested, is entactogen, meaning to touch within, and referring to this quality of connection with other people and more connection to one's inner process, often well-being, a sense of well-being and insightfulness, and less sense of loss of control than with classic psychedelics. But that's relative. Sometimes, especially people with severe PTSD, can have a sense of loss of control, and it's certainly not all about well-being, which we'll talk about some more. Sometimes people have some very challenging experiences, but the MDMA seems to help them work with them. It's complicated pharmacology involving a lot of release of serotonin as well as other monoamines, and there are also release of increased levels of a number of hormones, including oxytocin, which is promotes affiliation and a sense of connection. So it's a complex pharmacological picture. And as you probably know, this wasn't a new idea to use these MDMA or these other medicines for therapy. Before MDMA became illegal in 1984, there were a number of people reporting using it with therapy in a way that was helpful. Reputable reports, but no controlled trials were done. And then when it became illegal, it got, that put the clinical trial progress back a long time. But so basically what we did is pick up that thread and try to start controlled trials. So I'll give you a little quick background. I'm not going to talk a lot about the details of the studies because I've got the papers referred to, and you can read all the details. We've published quite a few papers about this by now. Just a word about where we are for those of you that don't know the FDA drug development process, which I certainly didn't know much about until I started this. Phase 1 trials are, first there's preclinical research in animals. That was done around the world by governments, so it saved MAPS a lot of money because governments were studying it because of the recreational use. And then we started at phase 2, which is the first time you give a drug to people with a diagnosis to test safety in that population and test treatment effects. And then phase 3 is where we are now, which is like phase 2, but bigger. And if you have 2 successful phase 3 trials, that's grounds for a new drug application. So we're approaching that. We're not at the application stage yet. So we got our first protocol approved by the FDA in November of 2001. These are our phase 2 trials. Then it took a few more years to get DEA and IRB approval, which was kind of a long saga, but we got our first study approved and started in early 2004. And then as of 2016, we'd done 6 phase 2 trials. MAPS had. We'd done a couple of those in Charleston, and then others had been done elsewhere. And that led to, those were very strong results, which led to, in summer of 2017, the FDA not only granted us permission to go into phase 3, they gave breakthrough therapy designation to MDMA assisted therapy. So these are the places where the 6 phase 2 trials were done, and the 2 in Charleston, 1 in Switzerland, and 1 in Boulder have been published. These are the papers, and the top ones are 3 of the papers from our studies in Charleston. The first was crime-related PTSD, mostly sexual abuse or rape, as I said, a lot of complex trauma. And then we did a 42-month follow-up showing sustained results, average of 3.5 years later. And then we did another study in Charleston with veterans and first responders, with also positive results. And then the studies in Switzerland and Boulder and the one in Israel, which hasn't been published, were all with mixed cause PTSD. So these are the pooled results of the 6 phase 2 studies that we published in Pharmacology in 2019. We had a large effect size, and even larger pre-post, but compared to the comparator in these studies was all the same therapy with 2 therapists, 8-hour sessions. So compared to the therapy, all that therapy, it still had a large effect size. And 2/3 no longer met criteria for PTSD. That's a graphic representation. The top line is with the therapy only. You can see actually people did improve with all that therapy, even people who had failed prior treatment, which was the case with all these people. Then you can see a much larger drop in the CAPS, which is the clinician administered PTSD scale. So that's the FDA kind of gold standard for PTSD studies. So really robust results. Interestingly, we found consistently that the results are maintained. Sometimes there's further improvement a year later. So it fits with this idea that we're catalyzing a therapeutic process that then keeps unfolding. And we also saw improvements in other things: depression scores, sleep, post-traumatic growth. And we did a little sub-study in our study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers, mostly Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. We had 3 different doses, and what we found was that the 30 milligram dose was not effective. People had some improvement, just as they did with inactive placebo with all that therapy, but the 75 and the 125 milligrams were both very effective. So I made a little questionnaire at the beginning of the study, which I shared with Dick to see if he thought it made sense, and he did. And so I'm going to just show you the main thing. What we looked at was whether the concept of parts came up during MDMA sessions. So with this study, this was not a study of IFS plus MDMA. It was our non-directed or inter-directed model. So we didn't set out to do IFS, but I was always thinking in terms of IFS. And if people brought up parts, then we would, work with them as needed. Very often people would kind of do it themselves, and we'd have to do very little. So other times it would look a lot like parts of an IFS session. Although I never had to do an unburdening, that always tended to take care of itself. And part of that was, we were trying to be consistent with our study design, which was apply the tools that we have if they're needed, but don't set out with an agenda to do any particular kind of therapy. But anyway, what you see is, this is what Dick referred to earlier. In people with the active doses, almost 80% of the time, parts came up during the session, as opposed to less than 30% of the time with inactive doses, basically. So, in the cases where parts did come up, 68% of the time they were brought up by the participants. And if the therapist brought it up, it was not just out of the blue. It was in response to, if the therapists were basically already talking about parts, sometimes we might say, well, it sounds like there's a polarity between one part and another, or something like that. We might actually use the parts language, but only in response to it coming up. So there's something about MDMA that really leads to awareness and engagement with parts, and the self-energy. So often there's a lot more self-energy available to make that, allow people to work more effectively with the parts. So to me, this is not only exciting in terms of, tools for supporting people in this kind of work, but also it's a nice validation, I think, of what Dick discovered and described, that, these people weren't primed to do IFS. A lot of them had never heard of anything like this, and yet they encountered their parts and worked with them. So I didn't think Dick's model needed any validation personally, but for those that thought maybe it does, I think this is kind of an independent validation of this phenomenon. I think, as Dick and I have talked about a number of times, I think one of the best ways to describe the effects of MDMA is it leads so often to a huge increase in self-energy with all of those C words, and you'll hear some of them in the video. I'll show you a little video clip later, and it's not somebody that ever had heard about the C words before, but there they were. And with the increased awareness, with the increased self-energy and increased awareness of parts, people just often can unblend, without any help from the therapist quite often. So that was our phase 2 research. I'll just tell you quickly about our phase 3 studies, which is the next step that we're in now. So we have 15 sites, 2 in Canada, 2 in Israel, and the rest in the US that are active right now and have been for several years. And we also have now compassionate use or expanded access approved in the US and in Israel, and that's just getting started. So it allows for a small, very limited, but a number of people to be treated outside of the phase 3 trials while we're doing the phase 3 trials, because our phase 2 results were so strong that they've allowed that. And meanwhile, we're starting studies in Europe. They're treating people right now, and these are the countries where we're going to have phase 3 sites, and right now they're just getting started with their phase 2 trials in some of those countries. So our agreement with FDA was we would do 2 phase 3 trials with 100 people each. Because our effect size is so large, they're quite a bit smaller than most phase 3 trials, but that's how the data showed, what the data showed we needed. So MAP1, the first phase 3 study, has finished. You can see that last 10 people are a different color because we had enrolled all 100 people, but we'd only treated 90 of them when the COVID restrictions came. So we agreed with FDA that we would stop at 90. And so that's what we did, and I'll show you those results. Now we've enrolled about 60% of the people in MAP2, the second phase 3 trial is underway right now. It was definitely slowed down by COVID, so a lot of sites had to stop for quite a while, but we're up and running, and we're getting there. So just to remind you, for those of you that don't know, this is what the course of treatment is. After careful screening and informed consent, there's a lot of attention to preparation, although it's a fairly short prep period, but we think that's really important. And then those blue larger blocks are the only time MDMA is administered, or in this case, inactive SIBO with all the same therapy. So it's an 8-hour therapy session with 2 therapists, and the MDMA is only taken 3 times a month apart. And then we think the integration sessions are really important as well. So that's how the study design works, and here are our results. We published this in Nature Medicine in May this year, and these were people with chronic PTSD, had to be in severe range, and 15 different sites with more than 80 therapists, most of whom hadn't done this work before. We trained them, with our training program that we developed during phase 2. And everybody got all the same therapy. And we had a independent rater pool of remote raters who were very well blinded, because blinding for the therapists and the participants is obviously a big challenge. But the FDA agreed that if we have the raters really well blinded, they never rate the same person twice. They do it on Zoom. That was enough for bias minimization. Of course, the FDA agreed that would be adequate, and they said if we had it in writing, if we reach a statistical significance of 0.05, better than compared to therapy only, that would be adequate for a successful phase 3 trial. And these were people with long histories of PTSD. It wasn't mainly single incident, short duration, long incidents of PTSD. We accepted people with past serious suicide attempts, and we had about 30% of the people that had positive suicidal behavior, but we thought it was important to include those people. And these were the results. Top line is the therapy only, and this is on the CAPS-4 scores, and the bottom line is MDMA. So we overshot our required p-value by quite a bit, 0.0001. So very, very robust results. On the CAPS score, we also saw highly significant results in decreases in disability, decreases in depression scores. And interestingly, when we looked at people with dissociative subtype, it tends to go with more complex PTSD. They did actually a little better than the people without dissociative subtype, which was a striking finding, I think. And, there was no correlation with whether people had had adverse experiences or not. People that had more than 4 severe adverse childhood experiences did just as well as people without them. And there were no significant differences from site to site. So really robust results. This shows the dissociative subtype versus the people without that. And you can see they had a bigger drop in CAPS when they got the MDMA than the other people did. Although when they got just the therapy, there was no difference. So it's pretty interesting, along the line. I think this relates to what you were saying, Dick, about, the idea that people, if they have severe complex trauma and they don't have any examples of somebody giving them self-energy, that they don't have access to that. This, in fact, I think would fit with maybe the reason they did even better is because they had been more cut off from self-energy, so getting access to it made an even bigger difference for them. And just to put this in perspective, the other 2 drugs approved for PTSD are Zoloft and Paxil. They were approved based on small to medium effect sizes, and this was our effect size here, so it's stacking up well. We had, these are the typical side effects that you can read about in the paper. I won't go through them, but we had a really good side effect profile, and the things the FDA was particularly asking us to track, adverse events of special interest, suicidality, cardiovascular events, and abuse potential were, there was no signal that MDMA was more than placebo. In fact, it was less in a couple of those areas. So obviously there are limitations. We had, not nearly as much diversity, ethnic, racial diversity, diversity of identities. We're doing better with that now, but that's been one of our challenges. And of course, the binding is a challenge. But the FDA feels that these, those are not enough to be really problematic. So again, really exciting results of the first phase 3, and we'll just have to see how we do in the next one. Interestingly, we did some exploratory measures. We looked at self-compassion, alexithymia, altered self-capacities, and eating attitudes. And we saw improvements in all of those areas. So, that kind of fits also, I think, with the idea that people are accessing more self-energy. So just to mention what we picture, we've discussed this with the FDA. We won't know for sure if and when we get approval. But we think that this is going to be only administered in certified clinics and not, be shipped directly to the clinics. It won't be a take-home drug, which I think is a good idea. People will have training in how to use this. So that's our results. I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach to the therapy and kind of what we see, and then I'll show you the video clip. Stan Grof has been one of our main teachers. He was one of the leading LSD researchers, and we studied with him using holotropic breathwork a long time ago. So basically, we've adapted what we learned from him and other teachers, Ralph Metzner, and of course, Dick Schwartz has been a teacher, and we've incorporated what we've learned from you, Dick, too. This is where we do the sessions. This is me and my wife, Annie, in our office in Charleston. And again, a lot of attention to preparation and integration. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so, our approach is relatively non-directive or self-directed. We talk about trusting the process is what Stan Grof talks about, and that, that's in a way, that's where the place from which you trust the process is when you're connected with self-energy. So that's such an important part. People spend part of the time lying down with eye shades and headphones. Sometimes that's most of it, but that tends to alternate with periods of talking to the therapist, and the ratio varies a lot. Sometimes there's a lot more talking than others, but it's usually about 50-50 probably is a good estimate. But we don't have an agenda for that. We try to, encourage people to spend some time inside and to do some of each, but we're very flexible about what that person's inner healing intelligence is the term we learned from Stan. You can call that self-energy too, I think. So we trust that that's a better guide to what this person needs than something that we figure out ahead of time that we think they need. So, and what we see when we take this approach is that all of these features of other kinds of therapy tend to come up spontaneously without, direction of the therapist so much. So, things like imaginal exposure and cognitive restructuring and a lot of transference and countertransference issues and psychodynamic issues, they all come up at various times for people, but we don't have an agenda about when that should happen. Sometimes people have a very affirming experience first and then go to the trauma. Other times it might be the other way around. We bring attention to the body, so there's overlap with somatic therapies. And then, as apropos of today, we're, as I say, a lot of material comes up about parts. and people also have transpersonal spiritual experiences. There tends to be corrective attachment. And, as we find what you find, Dick, that you don't need to do a lot of resourcing. It tends to happen more spontaneously. And people sometimes have powerful active imagination. So I think the fact that these different things come up in their own way, I think, is a good, for us, it kind of it reaffirms the value of not having an agenda ahead of time, having a relatively inner-directed approach. So why is MDMA helpful this way? That's a big topic that we could talk about for a long time. All I'm going to say really today is that, there's lots of neuroscience research now that's growing very rapidly, describing possible mechanisms, including, decreased activity in the amygdala and the fear center, increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the higher processing centers, a whole line of research about the way the different networks relate to each other and allowing for more flexibility, the possibility of a new response instead of being stuck in the same old response. The stuff about oxytocin, there are lots of interesting ideas about different ways this might be helpful, but I really encourage us to be aware of reductionist thinking because, as we've been saying, this is a much richer, deeper, wider, more interesting process than just, facilitating fear extinction or any one of those elements. So I don't think we want to miss the forest for the trees. So, but one way of thinking about the effects of MDMA that makes a lot of sense to us based on not only the neuroscience about the settling down the amygdala, but also what we see clinically. It fits with this idea, this is from one of Pat Ogden's books, about the optimal arousal zone or the window of tolerance. That if people are hyper aroused and overcome by anxiety and disorganized processing, it's not really helpful. Conversely, if they're maybe able to talk about the trauma, they're not emotionally connected, then it doesn't tend to be so helpful. So it looks like MDMA gives people a number of hours in this optimal arousal zone where they can really work productively with the trauma. And seen in IFS terms, I'd say that's the way to express that would be, if people are blended with firefighters or frightened exiles, they have trouble processing the trauma. If they're shut down by managers or firefighters, that gets in the way. But if there's enough self-energy, they can have the courage, compassion, clarity, creativity, etc., to really heal for what's coming up. So I think that's a wonderful way to understand what MDMA does. And I'll read you a few quotes. This is an important point, I think. Several people in the first study say, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. So, it's making the point that it's definitely not just that they get blissed out and everything's fine. Sometimes, often, working with trauma with or without MDMA is challenging and painful. And it can be painful with MDMA too. It's just that people tend to say, well, this is still really hard, but I feel as if I can do it now without being overwhelmed, or I don't have to shut myself down. I see that I can stay with this experience, and that can make all the difference. And then they tend to say, well, I saw that I was able to stay with these difficult emotions with the MDMA, so I think maybe I will be able to without the MDMA too, and that is what we tend to see. This is, I think, a good description of that would fit with the amygdala being turned down, or protectors relaxing. Maybe one of the things the drug does is let your mind get out of the way because the mind is so protective about the injury. So, that kind of brings me to thinking about what you were talking about before, Dick, that, one of the benefits of MDMA seems to be helping the protectors relax. But one of the pitfalls can be, bypassing the protectors too quickly. So I think we need to be really aware of that possibility, and that's where understanding IFS is really helpful. So we're really try to be proactive in the preparation sessions and throughout with checking with protectors and getting permission. And we don't always use the language, but we've always spent a lot of time addressing people's concerns, and we'll say, if people haven't been using parts language themselves, we're more likely to say, well, are there any concerns about this? Are there any concerns about maybe this wouldn't be okay, or what might happen? We spend a lot of time processing that, and whether I'm talking about protectors, I'm thinking to myself, this is a question for the protectors. And we all, we continue to ask permission and be really careful about that. You still have some backlash. I maybe talk a little bit about an example of that later, but we still, we really, I think it's important to not forget that that's a danger with MDMA as well as an opportunity. And this is sort of what I was saying before, that people say it changed my relationship to my emotions. This is a quote from actually the veteran that you're going to see a little clip from, talking about the spring cleaning. I'll just let you read it. So, whatever protectors had been hiding the stuff in the attic were able to step aside. And this is an important point. We spend a lot of time talking to people ahead of time about, it's not only what happens during the MDMA sessions. This is a catalyst that starts a healing process, and it's going to keep unfolding. Because especially with a clinical trial where you've got, very prescribed number of sessions and period of time, people can get really attached. So I got to get everything done in this 8 hours. And that's, it's really helpful to help them see that that's not actually the situation. It's a process. And that's consistent with, often results being better at 1 year than they are at 2 months with no MDMA in between. So I think instead of, as I said, we had improvements on all of these secondary measures that sort of tend to go along with self-energy, I would say. But I think I'm going to skip past this. Sorry about that. But I want to show you that slide. I've always liked this quote by Stan Groff about how much we can learn. And here's an example of, MDMA elucidating the multiplicity and the relationship of the parts. So I've got about a 10-minute video clip that I'd like to share with one of the veterans in that second phase 2 study that we did in Charleston. This is Nick. I can say his name because he's been quite public about his participation. If any of you have seen the book Acid Test by Tom Schroeder, Tom was an editor of Washington Post magazine, and then now is a freelance writer. Anyway, Tom was interested in our research from early on, and so Nick ended up giving Tom all his videos from all his MDMA sessions, all his prep sessions, all his integration sessions, and Tom wrote a book about Nick's process and about the research. So that's who this is. Anyway, Nick had done 2 tours in Iraq as a turret gunner in the Marines. Had a lot of combat trauma, a lot of moral injury as well. Things that he had done that he felt bad about, as well as being blown up, his truck being blown up, and him being injured himself. So he had a lot of severe PTSD symptoms, but in the prep sessions, he told us that the thing that bothered him the most was the rage that would just erupt. And he was never physically violent, but he would yell at his wife. He did punch the sheetrock one day, a hole in the sheetrock, but basically it was not mainly physical. But he said, this rage would come, and then he'd have great remorse and self-judgment about it, and feel terrible that he'd done that, and it made his wife cry. So he told us, he's an artist. He was in art school, actually, when he was in the study. He told us he had this image of this monster erupting from his torso, and he was trying to strangle it, and it was stabbing him inside. That was his experience of his rage. And so he told us about that in the prep sessions, and we didn't do much with it. We said something like, well, you may find that it's more a matter of forming a different relationship with that part of yourself. But we didn't say much about it. We didn't try to do anything with it. And then you'll see what happens with it. And you'll hear him refer to my saying it's a protector. That happened earlier in the MDMA sessions. We did not really talk in those terms before. So he basically just discovered these parts and this relationship to his parts during his first MDMA session. So I'll try to share that.
I just wanted to tell you, I had this this really intense feeling come over my body, and my heartbeat started beating real fast. But I didn't get at first. I started feeling a little afraid, but then once I started breathing, I've never felt that before. I literally felt my heartbeat start to slow down and everything when I started breathing and just relax, and the sensation. And it was amazing how not quickly it went away, but just how in control I felt of making it go away. So think about it now. When I got blown up myself, I don't know, I see it completely different now. Thinking about it, that moment that I got blown up, when it was happening, and everything was moving so slow, and my mind was just racing at the speed of light. I can really go back and visualize. I've never been able to visualize it so hard before. I can really feel what it was like, and there was this I just don't let myself feel sometimes so much hurt. I just feel like I should tell you something that was just really amazing. hard to put it in words. I feel things that would come up, and then every time they would just blow away like sand, and just voice this part of me, just like so wise and so intelligent, just like brought this peace over me that just said, you've always been taken care of, you always will be taken care of, that's nothing to worry about. And then it just flows away like sand. And then I tried thinking about that aspect of me that's just really rageful. And also, besides that image I told y'all about of, the fighting with them, I had this image of it like in a jail cell. I had that part of me locked up in jail, and it's just, it's dark, but it's got, bright red eyes and just really evil. And I thought of that, and I felt like I felt like I put that person there, and I went to it and just opened the door and hugged that person, and then the eyes just faded away, and it no longer had kind of an evil look to itself, and I visualized both of us just taking apart the jail cell and just, really becoming friends. And then I visualized that image I told you about of me, like it coming out of my hips and it stabbing me in the side and everything. And I just had a strong visualization of me reaching up where the knife was in my side and taking it out, and I took my hands off of its neck and didn't choke it anymore, and just really embraced it. And part of me realized that I think that I was taking that person and keeping him locked up because I was so afraid of him, and then that by putting him in that cell and keeping him locked up, that I was just making it worse for him. And I was really more beneficial if we kind of worked together, and I'd be, I don't know, I just it was really amazing. I never realized how much I thought I was being the peaceful person, but I didn't realize how much I was punishing that aspect of me. I think maybe in Iraq I saw what it was capable of, and I think I was too afraid to, and a part of me just feels so bad that I did that to him. And, I know it's me, but I just describing it wisely.
Part of you.
I don't know, I just got this amazing sense of just, I guess, wisdom. I really don't know.
Sounds a lot like wisdom to me.
I really feel so much more at peace with everything.
Great.
Even if I try and think about Iraq and everything, I somehow feel really peaceful about the fact that that's my journey, and that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Part of me I know this is part of the part of the drug, but when I try and think, am I going to be able to hold on to this this understanding and this somewhat of wisdom, this knowledge that I have now. Just asking myself that question, I feel like it's so profound that I don't think I could really forget it. I really felt like I met that aspect of me. It's just very, very calming, very sage-like. It just was like very comforting, and like I don't know, it's amazing how I felt like so much lighter. Like now, you know, whenever I blow up on people or blow up on my wife and get all, you know, angry and yelling at her, I feel like it's because I kept that person locked up. And of course, it's going to be hateful and resentful for being locked up. And so when it comes to the surface like that, it's going to be mean and make people cry. I really feel like letting it breathe and letting it be is just going to be so much better for me.
I think so.
And part of me that's saying like it's all your fault that you created all those feelings, the anger and all that other stuff. But then I don't know what part of me is saying that, because every time it says that, that sage part of me just says it's part of being human, you know. I don't know why I couldn't have come up with this on my own, but I'm glad I found it.
I'm glad too.
And it continued to unfold. Nick actually, he was randomized to 75, so he had 3 75 milligram sessions a month apart, after which he didn't have PTSD anymore. But then he he crossed over and had 3 125 milligram sessions. So it was remarkable that, you saw how beautiful it was what happened that time. And he still, in subsequent sessions, went back and processed a lot of other parts and a lot of pain from when he had shot people. And, it seemed that making peace with that warrior aspect that he thought was a monster was just such a helpful step in the beginning, that then allowed him to work with other parts. Later, he encountered a part that wanted to go kill people, which was really horrifying to other parts, and he processed that. And eventually, he at one point, he was really despondent and stuck for a really long time in one of the subsequent sessions. And at one point, he said, I just thought I was going to go over there and die. And I said, is that what part of you wanted? And suddenly he said, say what? He woke up from this really blah state when I asked him that. And then I said, is that what part of you wanted? And then he, long pause, tears, and he said, yeah, I think so. And then he cried and cried. So he was able to, access these different parts as he went along. And we didn't, we never could have orchestrated it or known how his process needed to go, that this needed to happen first and then that needed to happen. But having it, beginner's mind, and encourage him to have beginner's mind and see what comes and be present with whatever comes, that's what allowed him to have that amazing journey. So I don't know where we are, Bob, but if you have any thoughts or questions in the last few minutes before we switch over to more thoughts and questions.
Just how beautiful that video is. And I've seen it at least half a dozen times, because you very graciously let Nancy and me show it in our trainings, and touches me every time. And I really liked your additional comments about the other parts of him that came up. And one thing I want to say is that after our break, we'll take a 10-minute break in a few minutes. I hope, Michael, you and Dick will take the opportunity to talk together. I bet you don't get a lot of opportunities because you're both so overwhelmingly busy. So I want that to be part of the plan. And I had another idea, And it's an idea that just came to me, and sometimes those are really good and sometimes they're not so good. So, Dick, if you think it's a good idea and you're willing, maybe you could take part of the next 2 hours to lead us all in a collective unburdening.
Happy to do that. Sure.
Great.
Bob, please let me know, is there anything you would like to say or share before we start with the questions?
Well, I have a bunch of questions and I want to be a pig and ask them all first, but I won't. And if Michael, if you and Dick have questions for each other, I'd like that to be the priority. And then Michael Patersky will read you the questions from the group.
I would love to hear more, Michael, about how often you encounter backlash and what it looks like, and it's still a puzzle to me why there isn't more. And any thoughts about all that?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe one of the best examples is somebody that I don't know if you remember, but I spoke to you about. It's been a long time, but it was a veteran, a woman who had a really, really difficult childhood, and then joined the army and was in Iraq. And so she had trauma from the war, but also just, so much attachment injury and trauma from childhood. And she had 3 30-milligram sessions, which were very difficult for her, because we did find that low dose made people a little more anxious often without really helping. Mm-hmm. So when she had her first MDMA session, there was she had quite a powerful session with some really challenging times. And at the end of that first session, she felt she'd made suicide attempts before. She felt more suicidal at the end of that session, and we supported her through that. Then the next session, a month later, was a very beautiful session for a long time. She had some beautiful healing transference with Annie, with the mother energy, and feeling this must be what it's like to have a good mother. Really beautiful healing. Then she went into this, discovering these beautiful parts of herself. There were these big doors with things banging on them, and she was afraid to go there. And finally, she decided, we were very deferential, but she decided she could go there. And anyway, she ended up discovering these beautiful parts of herself in there that she kept hidden, that she didn't know were there. And they were these colorful birds, and they just wanted some attention from her. Because at one point she said, "The bird looks hurt," and I said, "What does it need?" And she said, "Attention." And I said, "Attention from you?" And she said, "Yeah. It wants to be petted." And I said, "Are you petting it?" And she said, "Yeah." So she had this beautiful experience. And then at the 7+ hours in, at the end of the day, she said, "I never knew there was anything so beautiful inside me." And she made an interesting comment that made me think immediately of what you say about, the self energy can't be tarnished. It's in its untarnished state in there. She said, "I just realized these parts of me, like bird oil, I was so afraid of having them, I kept them hidden because I was afraid they could get contaminated by all the sludge." And she said, "Now I realize actually oil runs off their feathers. The sludge runs off their feathers." It was incredible. So, of course, we were feeling great about it. And then she said, "Well, I kept them locked up because there's a part of me that hates me so much that it would just break their little necks." And I said, oh, how do you know that? And she said, well, it tells me all the time. So we came to the point, actually, Annie said, could we talk to that part? And she said, okay. So it was very clear. The only way to talk to it was with direct access. There was no way she could. That changed later in integration. She was able to talk to herself. But then I said, well, I'd like to speak to this angry part. And suddenly her expression changed. And she said, you think you're so fucking smart, asswipe. I'm never going to let her get better. You could have picked a better veteran. It's going to screw up your whole study. I'm just going to wait you out. This is all going to be over in a few hours. I'm going to take her back to the state she lived in and keep her fat. And the only reason she's just lucky, the only reason she hasn't killed herself is because other people are keeping her from doing it. And it was challenging. And as you may remember, I spoke to you later because I wasn't sure whether it was an angry protector or whether it was a critter. And I'm still not sure, although when I did, the one thing about it the next day in integration, before I did some more, I actually was able to do more of like an IFS session with her having access. I didn't have to do direct access, but Annie asked her if she recognized the voice. And she said, like, she looked puzzled and then immediately said, it's my mother's voice. Mm-hmm. So that was in favor of being a protector, but I'm still not sure. But it was very challenging. And she was somebody that she did a lot better for a while. And then 1 year she wasn't doing so well, but she was continuing to take care of herself more and went to a meditation retreat and she moved and got in a better situation. Little by little, she healed. And now, that was like years ago. And she's doing fantastically well now. We're still in touch with her, but it took a lot more time for her once the wheels were set in motion. And it was potentially dangerous. If she hadn't had good integration and close follow-up, it could have been bad.
Yeah, that's a great example of what I kind of fear, and because there are these parts that are really determined to not let the person heal, and they're parts. Sometimes they're we used to call critters, now call unattached burdens, but much more often they're just parts, and they carry the legacy burden, as this part probably did, of her mother's energy. And that legacy burden may have come down the generations from a time when it wasn't safe for her to shine, or anybody in her family. And so I'm really glad that you guys are on that, because I think there are lots of people using psychedelics without a clue about the potential for that kind of danger.
Yeah. As Stan Groff said, all these compounds need to be treated with great respect. Mm-hmm. All these medicines. It's not trivial. Yeah, that worries me because people get enthusiastic. Certainly they can be beautiful and wonderfully healing experiences, and people can miss the fact that it's not a cakewalk, and it can be dicey if you're not prepared.
And also to not freak out about a part like that.
Yeah.
As the facilitator, and to just get curious and stay in self. And again, if you and she can stay in self, it doesn't have power, and not get into a battle with it. But a lot of time I'll just say, ask it if it carries your mother's energy, and they'll say yes. Ask if it would like to unload that. If it didn't have to, would it like to not have to? And often they'll just send it out. So, yeah, I think that's some of where IFS can come in handy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and as I talked to her about this the next day in the integration, when she was feeling, really bad about having talked to me that way. So we did a lot of processing about, I didn't take it personally, but I admitted to her, I had a part that was pretty pissed at that part too, because we'd had a beautiful day. It was a long day. We were all tired. And part of me was saying, was really pissed that this part had come in there. But I also knew that it was really important that it did. And as I told her, I was trying to track that part because I knew I had to meet that protector with quite a bit of energy or I wouldn't have gotten anywhere. It was trying to just shut me down. But I was trying not to blend with my angry part. So to be, forceful enough, but not be in a parts war with her, that was my challenge.
Right.
So I was very grateful for having a way to understand what was going on.
Another question I'm not sure I've ever asked you, but it's related to, what I was talking about earlier. How often, or if ever, do you guys encounter what I would call guides, which spontaneously might come in and help with the healing? Because actually, as I watched the video again, in the beginning, he was saying, I hear this voice saying, you've always been protected, or what was it exactly? You'll always be okay.
You've always been taken care of. You always will be taken care of. Yeah.
And that's pretty classic guide messaging. So it might not have been a self. That could have been a guide. So
yeah, good point.
So have you kept track of that at all?
We've never had anybody specifically talk about a guide. We had one person talk about angels in the room.
Yeah, that's pretty
so
much.
That was,
yeah.
That was a guide, I guess, but she, I don't think she got direct messages from them. She reported it anyway, but she felt the support. So it was
she felt the support.
Non-verbal
thing.
That's
yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good question. We did not track that. Part of it was we're trying to not go off on tangents from the research protocol. So sometimes we were really curious about things, but we wouldn't pursue them because we had this format.
Yeah, it was like me when I was trying to get tenure. I didn't want to pursue that.
Yeah, so I think that's it. Glad we're talking about this because I think I tended to assume it was self when maybe it was more than that.
It's possible. Yeah. So those are my questions for now. I think one other thing I didn't say in my talk that's been very validating also, because I've had this running debate, for example, with Bessel van der Kolk, who will hold up a slide of a trauma survivor's brain where you see that the whole prefrontal cortex is offline, and he'll say, this is what we're dealing with. These people they have to relearn everything. They have to learn how to regulate themselves effectively. They have to learn compassion. They have to learn. And I'll say, no, that's what their brain looks like when a dissociative part takes over. But if we can get that part to step back, it'll light up just the way, it would otherwise. And he kept saying, prove it. And so we have tried to do some brain studies when people access self. And that's kind of still ongoing. But then he started to, he was the lead investigator in the Boston MDMA phase 3 trial. And So I could say to him, how do you explain how people with pretty severe trauma histories, just by taking this medicine, immediately can access this place unless it's already there? You know, if your theory was true, that their brain was damaged, they wouldn't be having this experience. So it's been validating that way as well. And he kind of grudgingly admits I've got a point. So
yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, well, Bessel said a number of times that when I first talked to him about this, like when I went to one of his courses with Pat Ogden many years ago, that I brought it up, he thought it was completely crazy, and now he's the PI at one of the sites, so he's coming along.
He's coming along. And you mentioned Pat Ogden and that window of tolerance idea, and I love how you